So we've already spoken about Ukraine in the context of Patriot missiles, but another reference to them is a chap called Valery Zaluzhny, who is former commander-in-chief and the current ambassador to the UK, actually. And he was making this assessment this week of NATO's military preparedness, obviously using the war in Ukraine as his benchmark, really. And his headline statement is that NATO is falling behind Russia in modern warfare. And in fact, not just falling behind, but 12 years behind. I'm not sure how he works out 12 years. And and that 12 years to even reach half of Russia's current battlefield capabilities on its present course. Well, if ever an article is going to get some attention, that's going to do it. Something that Al Cairns has said before, the former Armed Forces Minister, is that NATO, he says, Zaluzhny says that NATO is preparing for the wrong kind of war and almost of the style of the Second World War, while Russia, as we have seen, has adapted much faster to drone warfare, electronic warfare, AI-enabled systems warfare and precision strike capabilities. And we're sort of all aware of that, and probably as non-military people don't see the difference as much. But, warfare has changed. And
it's quite weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
Sorry, forgive me. Quite weird because while I take on board what he's saying, warfare, and you're right, warfare has changed. It's like it's gone forward in one sense, but backwards in another. Like we've got the drone warfare, which is, I think, sort of an inevitability of advanced technology. But then on the front lines, we've gone back to trench warfare, back to the First World War, effectively, haven't we?
Yep.
Whoever thought we'd have people in trenches fighting against one another? Because, I mean, during the Second World War, there wasn't the trench warfare that we're seeing now, was there? Really?
Not the same sort.
No, which is quite bizarre. I don't know. I just find interesting what he says, and I'd be interested. I don't know whether you know this, but whether he's just talking in general terms or whether he was talking in specifics in terms of where. Because we've had the conversation before on this pod, haven't we, about how poorly defended we feel that the UK is in relation to ballistic missiles, or for that matter, drones.
Well, insofar as we don't have Patriot missiles, do we? And I don't know what our capability is off the top of my head to defend ballistic and hypersonic missiles, which hypersonic is the even more deadly, isn't it? But anyway, Zaluzhny has said that Ukraine has already demonstrated this gap in a recent NATO exercise. A handful of Ukrainian drone operators reportedly overwhelmed a whole brigade of British forces in an exercise, illustrating how relatively cheap drone warfare and technology can take out old battlefield tactics. And I've heard that reported before.
Yeah.
He acknowledged NATO still had strengths, long-range missiles, air defense systems, space-assisted assets, and high technology. And they are obviously strengths, so it's not all bad news.
No.
But his belief is that NATO fundamentally need to reform in terms of procurement, training, how we're organized, technology-driven warfare. I guess he means drone warfare.
Yeah.
And this, of course, people will say, "Oh, is this a play to get Ukraine invited to join NATO to teach us?"
Yeah.
Well, I think sadly that's not going to happen for all sorts of reasons. But it does rather make you think. I'd say that we hear more about this from ministers than we have for a very long time, particularly Al Cairns, and in a similar vein, Healy, when he was Defence Secretary. It'd be interesting to see what Streeting says when he's got his feet under the table. And you wonder whether similar conversations are being had in other Secretary of States across Europe and across NATO as a whole. But it was sort of a question, really. Do you only get to be ready for modern warfare when you're in modern warfare?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? We discussed briefly on another pod that we were very unready for the Second World War, and we only started military production of munitions once we were, because there was the phony war, wasn't there, for about a year or so, before Britain actually started to get involved in the Second World War. And it does seem that way, doesn't it? It does seem that I don't know whether it's a reticence. I mean, there's people pulling in two different directions in this country at the moment, isn't there? There are people that are trying to say, "Oh, don't worry, because we're not going to." We're not going to get involved in the war. And then there's people pulling in the other direction, saying, well, it might happen in the next 3 years. We're on the verge of a war, and we're not prepared. And I think the most of the British public, quite understandably, would like to believe and lull themselves into the belief that we're not going to get involved, in a war, and that they don't want to think about that. Where the argument has always been that the more you prepare for it, the less likelihood there is that you'll actually need to get involved in it.
Yeah.
And it's getting that message across. And it's a brave politician, isn't it, who says that we're going to have to put an extra tuppence on the basic rate of income tax to be able to build our military up, to avoid us getting involved in a war which we might not get involved in.
Yeah, it's the worst type of business case, isn't it? We're going to spend money to achieve something that we hope never happens.
Yeah.
It's a bit like insurance, isn't it? There is no such thing as cheap insurance, I used to say when I was selling it. And it's true. If you've ever had to claim under a cheap policy, you've probably found you should have spent more. And that's where we stand. But you can take this guy's opinion with a pinch of salt if you want. But he was the commander-in-chief. He is the current UK ambassador. And he's not the first person to be saying this. So
no,
I wonder whether Mr. Healy and his fellow defence secretaries need to really look into this, or rather NATO. I don't know who drives it.
No, the figures were, I mean, when we were young lads, 40 years ago in the 80s, the figures that Western European nations were spending on defence were immeasurably more than now. They were nearer 10% than. We're now bulking at 3% to get to 3%. And you just wonder, I mean, I don't know whether your recollection of it was, and I appreciate there was a period during the 80s when we had cruise missiles in this country where there was unease about where we were heading. But for most of the Cold War, I think most people thought, well, it's unlikely that we're going to get involved in, tussle with the Soviets as it was then, but we were still spending that sort of money. And yet now it does feel, to me, it feels a lot more unnerving at present than it did for a lot of the 80s and the 70s.
Yeah, I mean, we're only talking here about, well, we're not only talking about Russia, but we probably mean Russia. The question would be, what would happen if Putin suddenly, somehow conquered Ukraine, and he was literally on the border of NATO? Would he be buoyed by that, or would he breathe a sigh of relief and say, I'm not doing that again?
$64 million question.
$64 million question. But
he's getting to the sort of stage in his life, I think he'd probably be thinking, well, let's test them with the Baltics and see whether the resolve is there to defend an incursion into Latvia or Lithuania on the basis that the Russian populations there were not being given freedom to practice their own language, or, the old argument and what have you. And where would we be? I could see an argument, because that's one of the things that I think he's established from the Ukrainian, that the further away you get from the front line. I mean, the British have always been bolshy, haven't they, to a degree? I mean, we've got really not a lot recently to be bolshy about, because we haven't got anything to defend ourselves. We've got a couple of old frigates that are going to shoot down these ballistic missiles if they come across. But the further you move away from the front line to places like Spain and Portugal and what have you, and Italy, they're not perhaps quite so upfront with sending money and supporting Ukraine in their battle against the Russians, are they? There's a sort of split there. And I think, if they were to march into Lithuania or Latvia tomorrow, would the Spanish really be all that? Would they send troops? I know that's where he's he's already got those little cracks, hasn't he, with regard to the way that they're supporting, the way that NATO's supporting Ukraine.
Well, the question is when he attacks a NATO country, because are they NATO countries?
They're NATO. The Baltics are NATO. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's the test, isn't it? There's nothing in Article 5 that says, but small ones don't count.
No.
You know, it's
No.
an attack on one. It's attack on all. I think NATO, they'd have to respond. They'd have to, and I think they would. I think they would. Maybe not willingly, but that's the whole point of having these exercises, isn't it? Is that you're ready to respond, which was why it was incredibly embarrassing, wasn't it, when it was our turn to command the exercise. I think it was in the Atlantic not so long ago. We had to borrow a boat because the boat that our admiral should have been on was either on its way to Cyprus or out of commission.
It does need a huge investment, doesn't it, in our capabilities? Whether anybody's got the political will is quite another question, isn't it?
Yeah. Mr. Burnham hasn't suggested that at the moment.
No.